Good afternoon, good evening. Just one more to sit through. And it's always a strange honor to me that I even get asked to come and talk to esteemed guests like you. And since we have so many people here from Wanxiang, I'll say, 对每一位从中国来的客人，欢迎来了，欢迎来了。Welcome. I am Patrick Byrne. Wired Magazine calls me Bitcoin Messiah, which I always think is kind of funny. My allegiance is not really to Bitcoin, it's to blockchain. Scourge of Wall Street is something else we might have time to be getting to. I studied at Stanford for my doctorate, and there's a great economist there, Thomas Sowell, at Hoover Institution. He says that you can divide the world and when it comes to institutional design for society between those whom he calls the constrained camp, constrained vision, who think that knowledge is costly to centralize. If knowledge is costly to centralize, you're going to favor social institutions that run on decentralized markets, decentralized information such as markets, common law, just in general self-organizing systems such as a beehive. There are other ways of organizing society, he calls the unconstrained vision, which primarily sees information and knowledge as cheap to centralize. If knowledge is cheap to centralize, then it's okay to have institutions that depend on centralized information, such as central planning in general, legislation, and just expertly managed systems, best exemplified by the Dilbert pointy hair manager. And if you think of it, the Dilbert jokes, every time everybody knows the Dilbert strip. If you think of the pointy hair manager, anytime he's in the strip, the joke is he's the guy in the corner office who thinks he's got the most information and he can make decisions for people at the knowledge frontier. And the essence of all those Dilbert strips is that knowledge is actually difficult to centralize, and you want decisions made at the frontier. Well, blockchain's significance is that for 6,000 years, cooperation among people required centralized institutions that could create trust. They required the pointy-haired Dilbert managers, who are not as smart as they think they are, and they're open to corruption. And one form or another, all kinds of centralized institutions we've created for recorded history have been there to create the trust. Cooperation always requires trust as its grease, because if we're going to cooperate to do something and we create some benefit, I need to trust that if I put in the energy to do it, I'm going to get my share of the benefit and such. The nice thing about blockchain is we're going to learn we don't need these centralized institutions anymore. That's why this is such an extraordinary time to be alive. Such an extraordinary time to be alive, because whereas the internet made information cheap to publish, and that disrupted publishing and a number of other industries, I was out here about 5 years ago in a stealth blockchain company here, some very smart guys. They had a wall full, they had 160 institutions in society that ultimately they had realized you could disrupt with blockchain. And some of those institutions are things like a credit card company, and some of them are things like various government offices. They're just social institutions, and different countries draw the line between the two in different places. I'll give you an example of one that I'm really excited about and I'm turning my life towards, and that is there's 7.5 billion people on Earth, 2.5 billion are globalized, 2/3, 5 billion are not. They live in lives that it's hard for us to even understand. They don't live in a formal rule of law like we do. They live in a favela on a hillside outside a city in Brazil. They live in places where they don't have formal rights. There's a great economist in Peru, Hernando de Soto, who is really the father of this area of economics. He's the great economist of those informal people. And his work showed that by lacking formal rights, including property rights, there's all kinds of things they can't do. They can't obtain credit. And if they try, and that they can't obtain credit, they don't have incentives to improve their land, things like that. And you don't have an incentive if you never know. You may have been living in some shanty town, and I don't mean to be pejorative about it, but there's not a nice word, I guess a favela is or a barrio or something, that that you may have been living in this place for 4 generations, and you may have some informal certificate of occupancy that your neighborhood recognizes, but it's not recognized outside of that, so you don't have an incentive to improve, and most importantly, you can't go to a bank, borrow money, and start a business. His work showed that what really got the United Kingdom and the US rolling early on was that we got land titling right. And a great example of that comes actually from here in, I'm not seeing a timer. Could the organizers, the lovely David Bailey, and by the way, can we give them a round of applause, David Bailey and the people from BTC Inc.? As always, they do the best conferences. They do lovely conferences. I don't know my time, so you'll have to fix that at some point. So it happened, and there's a great way to illustrate this, actually, right here with California. In 1849, the gold rush, there were 850 different creeks and 850 different mining camps. And in every mining camp, turns out they all did the same thing. They came up with some informal system. Maybe it's a tree, and when you want to make a claim to 100 feet of creek, you make your mark on a piece of paper and you nail it on that tree. Or we have eventually you have a ledger, and in the ledger, the 30 or 40 guys up this creek are going to be working. They all agree that there's some ledger that some old codger keeps, and that's the book of truth. And what happened was, 10 years later, when the judges and the lawyers showed up, they took those books and they wove them into the state law of California, the state property law, is where it came from. And that's why Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court jurist, said later, a few decades later, great law is discovered and not made. By which he means it's discovered, it's there and it's unearthed. Society is already finding ways to cooperate, and great law unearths it. It doesn't come from on high. So that happened in the United States, and it's happened in the Commonwealth territories, or in some of them, and England really got it right. But because it can't happen in the developing world, his great book was called How the Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Worked in the West and Failed Everywhere Else. And where it fails everywhere else is they can't start with that fundamental layer that is land titling. And if you're in a place like Haiti, and they documented this, if you're in a place like Haiti and you try to get land, title to your land, you may have lived there for 4 generations, but it's going to take you 30 years and 300 steps, and every step there's some payola, and it's just a mess. So the effect of that is all kinds of terrorism is actually tied to that. The business model of the terrorist groups, from Peru, where this was discovered regarding Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, to FARC, to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, is they'll go into places and say to the people in these informal areas, show us your informal records and we'll put our stamp on it, we'll recognize it, and you support us. And that's basically the exchange that drives much of terrorism. And that's been shown number of places. Environmental damage, of course, if people don't know who owns what, there's tragedy of the commons, there's migration, and instead what they found in Peru is they went out, there was a terrible terrorist movement there, a Maoist, I shouldn't say, because a Khmer Rouge-like group called the Shining Path that wiped out 70,000 people. And it was looked at as the greatest security threat in the Western Hemisphere, frankly. And it got really crazy. There was a Khmer Rouge-like event there. And this guy went out, this economist, he calls it the Indiana Jones part of his life. He went out to, with the government's permission, to these different places and titled them up. Took their informal titles back to Lima, got them turned into real documents. And they titled up all these peasants, campesinos, I guess, and everybody switched sides. And in 6 months, this unstoppable group suddenly it actually collapsed in 6 months. And it's the last time that the West won a war against terrorism, actually, arguably. And Peru went on to have, actually the leaders of the movement had to turn themselves in because they were themselves getting scalped and such, because the peasants rose up and overthrew them once they had a legal way to get that the government would recognize title. And Peru has since gone on to be quite a success story, because you get all kinds of small-scale entrepreneurship. Once you have title, you have a way to borrow $3,000 to start a fruit stand, and capitalism gets going. I'm working on this because I think that between blockchain and mobile apps and social media and digital marketing, it's possible to put those together and achieve this vision. The problem, this has always been a theory, but there's not really been the right implementation. I think it's possible to implement this very quickly across big countries. And I'm actually sort of turning my life towards this, towards pursuing this. There's, of course, something else, though, that I'll tell you about for people who are more interested in the business side of things. I'll tell you another application, another company we've started. So I've announced publicly I'm selling our retail business so that I can focus on these blockchain things. That's one of the blockchain companies. Here's a different one. There's something called settlement. And that's in a stock exchange. When you buy and sell stock, the process of the money in the stock changing hands. And you might, how it used to work in America, even my father took me to, in 1969, took me down to Wall Street, and I saw all these people on bicycles. I thought that was so strange. There were still guys on bicycles, and they were riding around among the brokers with burlap sacks of stock certificates. And that's how stock was still getting settled in the 1960s. And what happened was volume quadrupled in the late 60s. Volume quadrupled, and Wall Street bottlenecked. It's called the Great Wall Street Paperwork Crisis, and only the old-timers remember it, but there was actually a point Wall Street was open 4 days a week and limited hours each day, so the guys on bicycles could catch up. It was like a database freeze. And it rippled, and it took down brokers. So they came up, the industry had a meeting, the SEC got, and in 1971, and said, we got to fix this. And it's either going to be one of two systems. One is central counterparty clear. Well, what the industry, largely wanted was an electronic peer-to-peer settlement system. But the SEC decided, probably correctly, that the technology was not ready for that. And we went to something called central counterparty clearing, which is we created one centralized institution that everyone could trust, called the DTCC. And we said, everybody will just connect to it, and it will be the counterparty to everybody's clearing, just one institution to trust. And then all the stock in America, here's an interesting question. Who here, raise your hand if you own any public stock in any public company? All of us with our hands up are incorrect. None of us actually own stock. I'm going to show you why. The way this was architected, there's another company called CD & Company that all the stock in America, the shares, the ownership got transferred to. CD & Company, and I don't mean it warehouses it, or I mean, it's not just like the warehouse. It has the legal ownership of all the corporate stock in America. And there are issued representative shares called share entitlements from that. And when you're trading in the system, what's really going on, I won't walk through all the little details, but what's really going on among brokers is, and there are brokers who are not plumbed into the DTCC. There's brokers who are plumbed in directly, called clearing brokers, and then there's a couple thousand other brokers who are plumbed into them, like they become the hubs of their own hub and spoke systems. And what's going on when you trade stock is these share entitlements are just trading around among in the system. The actual shares are immobilized. And I don't mean just physically, and I don't mean just like custodian. I mean the legal ownership is immobilized in a company called CD & Company. And if you read your broker statement, and you read to page 13, that little part upside down, backwards in Greek, explains this. You actually don't have legal ownership. What you have is a claim. When you think you own 100 shares of stock, what you really have is a claim, a contractual claim against a broker who has a contractual claim against another broker who has a contractual claim against maybe another broker, who has a contractual claim against the DTCC, who has a contractual claim against CDN Company, who actually has the legal ownership. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Well, here's one thing that went wrong. Listen to this closely.
There are additional regulatory changes that this breakdown of the central pillar of competitive markets requires in order to return to stability, particularly in the areas of fraud, settlement, and securitization.
October 2008, as the world melted down, they got Alan Greenspan out of retirement to go to Congress and say, what's happening? And this has been kind of forgotten in history. What he actually said that day was fraud, settlement, securitization. And if you remember, there was a lot of gloating on papers and media I would generally call left, who don't like markets, saying, oh, see, even Alan Greenspan says markets don't work and such. And they taught, of course, fraud. That was Bernie Madoff, securitization, mortgage-backed securities. What people forget is the settlement system froze. That week, September 15th, 2008, what actually happened was the settlement system froze. That terrible cloud of red share entitlements that I'm talking about, that I was talking about, that all seized. That's what actually happened. So now imagine true settlement with a ledger. Imagine you've got a magic ledger, cryptic or graphically protected, public, transparent, immutable, and just as you could payment can be reduced to wiping out one coin and writing it somewhere else. So could a stock market be, a capital market, be changed so everything just becomes ledger entries within a ledger. That was this whole system, which has all kinds of costs and, in my mind, all kinds of room for mischief. I think there are examples. This is fractional reserve banking without a reserve requirement. And there are people who have figured out there's different ways to manipulate this. And if any of you are familiar, I'm just curious, anyone even remember that fight I got in 15 years ago with Wall Street? Raise your hand if you remember that. Okay, okay, interesting. So what I got in a big fight with Wall Street about is I recognized that this was dangerous, could be manipulated, and could collapse. And I said that publicly and got a lot of heat for it. It was kind of a funny period. That could all be replaced with this ledger technology. We started working on this at Overstock 4 years ago. Over 4 years ago, we created a company called T0. Because that system I just showed you, that runs on a T+3 basis, which means T plus 3 days is now T plus 2. But with the beautiful thing with blockchain and settlement, the trade is the settlement. Just like when you're a kid and I'm buying a baseball glove from you for $5, and here's my 5, and you've got your glove, and we let go at the same time. You know, that's what the blockchain does. And you build a capital market around that. It means you don't need that crazy red cloud settling 2 or 3 days after the trade. You can have, well, we went out and bought a routing hub within Wall Street that routes 2.5% of the orders of the US equity market. So we decided from the beginning not to build this outside of Wall Street, to build it right in the heart of Wall Street. We bought this company called SpeedRoute. We got 3 years ago, we got deemed approval from the SEC that it could trade blockchain. And what that means was we could do this legally. We could do that thing I just showed you legally. To my knowledge, we're the only guys in the world who have that. I saw there was an announcement this week about the SEC, about Coinbase buying or not buying. I didn't quite understand. There was some sort of announcement, then they rolled back or something, but that they're doing what we did 3 years ago. And there's others behind it. Goldman's wants to, there's others who are doing this too. We issued the world's first private blockchain security in August 2015. We issued the world's first public blockchain security. We filed with the SEC in December 2015. It took a year. And in December 2016, we got deemed effective from the SEC and issued. You can pull up on your phone right now, OSTKP. People forget there is one and only one public blockchain security in the world. SEC stamped. It's been trading legally a year and a half now. It trades by appointment. It never trades. But I mean, I think myself and about 5 other people own all there is. It was de minimis. It was but I mean, it was in the millions. I think like literally, I don't know. There's a small. It never trades. But the point is, there is a legal public security out there that the SEC, that went through the SEC process. I said it's been out there a year and a half. So we've, and then we've done. We're creating other interesting products like digital locate receipts, which, without going into the details, one of the very profitable, I believe the most profitable area of Wall Street is an area having to do with short selling and the technology that underlies short selling. And I think it's actually implicated in a number of different crises. It's not responsible for the entirety of the pension crisis. I mistakenly have said that publicly in the past. I think it's responsible for about $20 to $30 billion a year of profit for Wall Street, probably in a way that probably due to just the simple opacity of this market. You know, I was taught once that whenever the Wall Street hates, I used to work on Wall Street, and since I'm dropping names, Buffett was my great teacher. And I've been lucky, one of the great pleasures of my life is, and lucky breaks I got was Warren Buffett was my Dutch uncle and taught me a whole bunch of things since I was a kid. And one of the things was, though, that Wall Street hates things that go exchange traded, because when they do, about 80% of the margin collapses, which is kind of an indication. Another way of saying that is when they have their clients in the dark, look what they do. There's an area of Wall Street that is still basically a call-out market. It's not even a call-out market. It's a terrible market. It's the area that underlies getting the locates that let you short sell. I believe that that's really responsible for some fraction of the pension crisis. Now, in fact, it would probably take about $300 billion a year to fix the pension crisis nationally, so can't do that, but there's a lot of money in this. We have built a system that does this. The current system that Wall Street operates on is, I believe, quite spongy and has a lot of rubber in it, and there's a reason for that. The rubber lets both the hedge funds do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, but it lets the prime brokers make a lot of money. That's all. That rubber can be replaced with blockchain. I'm not going to walk through it in any detail, but that rubbery system can be replaced with blockchain. Anyway, that's just one of that whole list of products. You saw me talking about with T0. We recently did a deal with the Boston Exchange box, that to bring up all this, our ATS technology, to bring it up as an exchange, as the nation's and the world's first a stock exchange that is just blockchain. So these are the kinds of things we're working on, things like solving world's poverty with blockchain, things like the capital markets, voting, very interested in, basically 5 years ago, we had this idea. We knew that blockchain was going to change the way business is done, the way government is done. And we said, what are going to be the most fundamental processes of this new age? Let's get into those. So that meant, to me, civilization starts with land titling. And then you need some form of money. So how about blockchain meets central banking? And then civilization needs a capital market to match savers with and that's blockchain meets capital markets. And then blockchain meets e-commerce, or meets commerce and supply chain. And then lastly, voting, because my hope is that this new age for mankind is one where the consent of the governed still matters. So that was the tech stack we picked. And we have leading edge investments in all but the layer on supply chain. We have a few small supply chain investments, but still looking for other good ones. Actually, that's probably gotten away from us. But voting in particular, and there's a company called Votes back in Boston, I think, that we have a nice investment in. And boy, even 2 years ago or a year ago, when you talk to people about using blockchain in voting applications, people didn't see the logic. But given certain things going on, I'm just seeing, even today, I saw an article that's starting to kick. The thing that might get blockchain, wouldn't that be funny if the first product that really gets this blockchain into consumers' hands in a big way is if it starts showing up in voting systems? Okay, it has been a great honor to speak with you. Thank you very much. Good luck.